This morning, I'm going to continue the lecture series on Genjo Koan, and we have one more lecture after this. So this is lecture number 12, and I'm starting to view the Genjo Koan as a roadmap, our practitioner's guide to how to think about practice realization. And so that's one thing that Dogen's doing, he'll present that, and then the next thing I think he does almost immediately afterwards is to present to us what he would consider to be the kind of common misconceptions that we might have about practice. So the section we're going to talk about today is the paragraph, "Here is the place, here is the way unfolds. The boundary of realization is not distinct. For the realization comes forth simultaneously with the full experience of Buddha Dharma. Do not suppose that what you attain becomes your knowledge and is grasped by your intellect. Although actualized immediately, what is inconceivable may not be apparent. Its emergence is beyond your knowledge." So that's Kaz Tanahashi's translation. So I would say this paragraph is about how we should think or not think about realization as a thing, as something to be attained or defined. So let's look at the first sentence. Here is the place, here the way unfolds. So Tanahashi makes a paragraph break here, but actually Dogen's continuing the thought that he had from the previous line at the end of the paragraph. And that thought, this place that he's referring to, refers to the sentence right before this: to attain one thing is to penetrate one thing, to meet one practice is to sustain one practice. So that's what Dogen's clarifying here in this section. So we might think that the line is kind of abstract, but again, he is clarifying here right now as this place and this time. So our practice happens right here, right now. And this present moment is where one discerns or enacts what he's saying is penetrating one thing and meeting one practice, sustaining one practice. So he's saying this is where this happens, is right here in the present moment. So here at this place, one practices the Dharma. And that is a deeply understanding that here, in this moment, is a moment of meeting, sustaining both self and other as manifesting the way. So that's important, that self and other are manifesting the way as this one practice. So I would say this is kind of ground zero of Genjo Koan, ground zero of what Dogen calls practice realization. Practice realization, again, is the simultaneity of practice and realization functioning together. We do not practice to become realized. Our practice comes deeply from inside. Our Buddha nature asks us to practice. And that very practice itself is a manifestation of Buddha nature's realization, our realization. Not a selfish kind of realization, but this connection that we have with reality itself, this suchness of reality, komyo, the radiant light. That's practice realization. And the only place that happens is here and now, in this moment. So that's why Dogen says a few sentences earlier in Genjo Koan, when you find your place where you are, and your place in practice, not just, that you're at the supermarket as opposed to being, at home. When you find your place where you are, practice occurs, actualizing the fundamental point, which is Genjo Koan. When you find your way at this moment, practice occurs, actualizing the fundamental point. So that's what he says earlier in Genjo Koan. So this place, this present moment, which includes everything, is where we practice. It's a very simple idea. It's really hard, I think, for us to get our minds around this and to enact this. We're always letting our mind talk us out of this truth. I think it's very entertaining to listen to our minds. When we sit zazen, it's so much more fun to plan, to go over things that we've done before, to rewrite history. So it's very entertaining to listen to our mind rather than just sitting, doing shikantaza. Just stopping and listening to someone else, to something else, other than our thoughts. So I would say our interior dialogue is very seductive. So this place is the place and the time and the being of practice realization. So when we penetrate deeply and practice with our best effort, the Dharma will unfold itself and to ourselves. So I would say the next part of this Genjo Koan, the next sentence is, he's starting to answer the question, how does it unfold? And what can we expect? How can we frame this activity for ourselves? So then Dogen writes, the boundary of realization is not distinct. For realization comes forth simultaneously with a full experience of Buddha Dharma. The boundary of realization is not distinct, for the realization comes forth simultaneously with the full experience of Buddha Dharma. So we say, what and when is realization? I think that's a question as practitioners we have. Is it a hard boundary of, I don't have it and now I do? We really want to know an answer to this question. People come all the time, we come and we want to frame our experiences. This is the experience of enlightenment. Yet here Dogen is saying, he's saying, well, you may not know. So earlier in Genjo Koan, Dogen wrote, when Buddhas are truly Buddhas, they do not necessarily notice that they are Buddhas. And he also wrote, to study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things. So using the example that Dogen's talking about, if you forget the self, if I or you or we forget this self, this means that you are no longer looking for enlightenment as something distinct with boundaries which separate you from the unenlightened or join you with the enlightened, which I would say is something that as practitioners is very seductive for us. This full experience of Buddha Dharma means that you are inclusive of other as self. Now, this doesn't mean that you merge with other as in the sense of no longer being aware of yourself as a particularity. That's not what it means to say to forget the self. It means to forget the selfish self, the self that is attached to itself getting what it wants. But you are still a particular person, so that never goes away. So this is the meaning of realization comes forth simultaneously with the full experience, which can also be translated as knowing is born together with and studies together with the exhaustive investigation of the Buddha Dharma. So this is this non-simultaneity, which means that the boundary of realization is not distinct because it's not something that's sequential. So that's why he said, Dogen writes, realization comes forth simultaneously with the full experience. So that's the second part of the sentence. The boundary of realization is not distinct, for the realization comes forth simultaneously with the full experience of Buddha Dharma. So we can say this realization comes forth simultaneously with the full experience, which can also be translated as knowing or realization is born together with and studies together with the exhaustive investigation, this penetration of the one thing, of the Buddha Dharma. Knowing is born together with and studies together with the exhaustive investigation of the Buddha Dharma. So Dogen says this again in Busho. He writes, the Buddha nature always studies together with becoming a Buddha. The Buddha nature always studies together with becoming a Buddha. So it's this intimacy, this simultaneity of practice realization, this simultaneity of being verified by all things, as Dogen says earlier in Genjo Koan. So, to repeat this phrase from Busho, the Buddha nature, which we can understand as penetrating the one thing that Dogen was talking about earlier, always studies together with becoming, this practicing of the one practice, becoming a Buddha. So this full experience is about fully presencing yourself as forgetting the self and actualizing by the integration with myriad things. This studying and becoming together. And since this is a complete integration, it's a complete, integrative, interdependent activity, how would you be aware of the boundaries of who did what, or what did, or what is? So that's what Dogen's talking about. How are you going to be aware of those boundaries if you're just engaged, completely engaged in the totality of that experience, not defining it to yourself, living the experience? So the practice that Dogen's suggesting to us is paying attention to what is happening right now and not being worried about this boundary between enlightenment or unenlightenment, or being human or sentient beings. So this is something we get caught in as practitioners, I think. We want to be able to define to ourselves the nature of our experience as being enlightened or unenlightened. And that can't happen within the boundary of the totality of just the self. It has to happen within the context of everything simultaneously functioning. And when that's happening, the boundaries are not distinct. This full experience of the Buddha Dharma is experienced as a kind of kinship, intimacy, with the totality of our experience of self and other as what Dogen's calling one thing, one practice. So, true practice realization, Genjo Koan, arises from this uncalculated experience. It is throwing ourselves completely into the practice, throwing away completely the notion of enlightenment, letting go of defining our experience in that way. It is throwing ourselves completely into the practice without thinking there is something outside to be attained. So then Dogen says in Genjo Koan, do not suppose that what you attain becomes your knowledge and is grasped by your intellect. So here's another problem that we have. So he's talked about one, he says this boundary of realization is not distinct, where we want to make it distinct. Now he's saying, well, don't think that what you attain becomes your knowledge. We like to think about that too. We like to grasp and hold on to our experience. He says, don't think that what you attain becomes your knowledge and is grasped by your intellect. So because this activity response, this Genjo Koan, is born from and studied together, as he says in Busho, you should not think that you know all about it. That's the boundary part. You should not think that you know the boundaries of this experience. This knowing would be defining a boundary which is actually a boundaryless boundary. There is no boundary there. Now, we like to think that once we have attained some understanding, that we can file it away intellectually and bring it forth like a kind of tool. And I would say it's kind of like, I don't mean it like as a tool in the sense of being skillful means. I mean it as a way in which maybe we say, oh, I am this, I am that, I have attained this, I have attained that. So one of the things that as a teacher that people talk to me about is we have a Satori experience, a Kencho experience of oneness, of this full appreciation and direct experience of penetrating one thing, because that's a way to discuss this. It is actually this way we really have become aware of in this very non-intellectual way that we share these boundaryless boundaries between self and other. This is a direct experience of penetrating one thing. But the problem is that we want to continue to hold on to that. We always want to be able to feel like it means something, about the self, that we can hold on to it, that we are now enlightened. We have now had this experience, which is different from the boundary of something else. But actually, it's something that's elusive. It's like trying to pull water from a fast-running stream with your fingers. You know something has happened. You feel its wetness, but you can't grasp it or hold it. You shouldn't try to grasp it and hold it. And yet we do. Maybe we should just accept that fact, that we do try to grasp it and hold it. We do try to say, oh, I must know something special now. So, while we are grasping and holding, it does not negate the fact that we were actually in the stream, and then we feel its wetness in its vitality. But again, as Logan says, do not suppose that what you attain becomes your knowledge and is grasped by your intellect. So you can hear all that chatter, but don't hold on to it. I'd say don't take it too seriously. That's the self remembering the self in a way that's not particularly helpful. So the next line is, although actualized immediately, what is inconceivable may not be apparent. Although actualized immediately, what is inconceivable may not be apparent. Its emergence is beyond your knowledge. So this kind of very visceral experience that we have usually comes up suddenly. I would say this actualized immediately. We're having a direct experience of myriad things actualizing the self. So we know what it is to put our hand in the stream. Yet often in the middle of this very intimate experience, we take note. Our not forgotten self remembers. But in that remembering in and of itself, that remembering in and of itself is not spiritually special. Because it is concretized and labeled as something desirable for the self's understanding, or it's something that we cling to. As soon as we do that, little bells should go off in our head. Because we're no longer having that experience. Now we're defining it as something. We're giving it boundaries. We're saying it's something in particular. And that it means something to the small self, which is now we're special. We've had a special experience. So this is not to negate the experience. It's to say we should question how we're defining the nature of that experience. Now, what Tanahashi is calling what is inconceivable may not be apparent is the word mitsu in Japanese. So he says, what is intimately ours, another translation of mitsu, which means that something's secret or hidden, and in Zen it often refers to Buddha nature or to reality itself, or to be translated as something intimate. So here he says, another translation of this would be, what is intimately ours is not necessarily realization. Okay, so this would mean if we use intimately as Buddha nature to say what is intimately ours, our Buddha nature is intimately ours as it is intimately the nature of everything. So another way to kind of talk about the sentence, understand the sentence, would be to say, Buddha nature, which is intimately ours, is always manifest because it is reality itself. But to our mind, it's not apparent. Consequently, when we think we understand, what we think we understand may not be what is actually happening. We may only be seeing part of or none of this inconceivable, this Buddha nature, this intimacy, this thing that is, at least in part, hidden to us. So I would paraphrase the sentence as saying, although your true nature comes forth in the moment's immediacy, what is mitsu, what is secret, intimate knowing, non-intellectual, experiential interbeing, what Dogen's calling one thing, one practice. This moment's immediacy is probably not known to us consciously. We make up stories about that unexpected, vital manifestation of our life with all beings, our beings, being our beings, but those stories that we make up are not what's actually happened or is happening. What actually happened is probably not knowable to us. So that's why Dogen writes the next line. Its emergence is beyond your knowledge. Its emergence is beyond your knowledge. So what is this emergence? This emergence is what is coming forth. It's this beingness that's beyond our intellectual sphere. So we say, what is it? What is it? Is this actualized mitsu, or intimacy, as this one thing, responding, merging, and weaving the tapestry of our and all of life together as it's arising in this particular Dharma position that we are in this moment. It's this shared, intimate practice, gyoji, continuous practice, the intimate practice with the whole world functioning together. The moment of one practice actualizing one thing happens in your daily life and you don't even notice that it's special. So an example is, we open a door for a person whose hands are full. We do not say to ourselves, I am enlightened, or this is enlightened action. Even though the moment is an enactment of the manifestation of Buddha nature. One thing, one practice. We know our saintness. We feel empathy. We see the connection, and we respond to that connection immediately without thinking about it. This is an enactment of the manifestation of Buddha nature. One thing, one practice. This moment is without our knowledge. We don't grasp it with our intellect when we open the door for someone. Nor do we feel we have crossed over from samsara to nirvana. This intimate moment is not apparent to us, and it is truly beyond our knowledge. Do you see these everyday activities that we engage in? These are the activities that we do over and over again without even thinking about it and without defining itself to us in this way. And those are the activities of this complete response that comes from knowing that we are this one thing, interconnected, interbeing, impermanent, compassion with, no inherently existing self. In this practice realization of gyoji, continuous practice with all beings, the world making the world, weaving the tapestry, the whole works, all the things that Dogen talks about. It's in that moment. I'm not saying it's not in the moment of Satori or Kensho, but those are the moments that we want to hold on to because they feel very special to us, make us feel like we're special in some way. But don't forget, there are these other moments as well, which are perfect examples, I think, of what Dogen's talking about. And you don't have to start thinking about them as now I'm enlightened. Just forget about it. Just forget about it. That's really all we have to do. Forget the self. Don't worry about it. Just respond with what's already there. So, we should not understand this section of Genjo Koan to be anti-intellectual. Rather, it's anti-making up stories. Dogen is not opposing the discerning intellectual activity versus realization. So he's not saying realization is something that doesn't involve one's discerning mind, one's intellectual processes. Both are necessary components of this Buddha nature's functioning. So he wrote in Shobogenso Hotsu Bodaishin, which means arousing the aspiration for enlightenment. Dogen wrote, without discriminative intellect, the thought of enlightenment cannot be aroused. We do not understand the discriminative mind as the thought of enlightenment itself, but we arouse the thought of enlightenment through this mind of discriminative intellect. So this is, I think this translation is for He Jin Kim, and if you guys have read Kim, you know he's doesn't use easy when he can use more harder. So anyway, without discriminative intellect, the thought of enlightenment cannot be aroused. So the thought how we think about practice, having that roadmap for practice, is something that we have in our mind that we're defining to ourselves. We're doing this, not that. You know, we're doing zazen. We're not doing visualization practices. So we have this particular path that we're following that's outlined in a particular way in Soto Zen. So we have this discriminative intellect which allows us to have this thought about what practice is. And without that thought, he's saying it cannot be aroused. And then we do not understand, but we should not understand the discriminative mind as the thought of enlightenment itself or as practice itself. Don't mistake thinking about practice or having an intellectual understanding of practice as practice itself. But we arouse the thought of enlightenment through this mind of discriminative intellect. So Dogen's saying they are working together. They're working together. Both sides are necessary. So we have an idea, a vision, a map. And that's what this fascicle, Genjo Koan, and all of this practice-oriented teachings, talking, writing, all this is about, is how do we practice. So our mind is not the enemy, and the discriminating intellectual mind is not the same as what is actualized immediately, reality itself functioning. But it's not different than, it's not opposed to. Both are necessary components of the mature practitioner. So I think Dogen's saying we know and we don't know. And in this case, Dogen's talking about practice realization and not making up stories about it. Just flow with it and don't try to make it into anything and don't try to make it into nothing.